Good afternoon or evening or whatever time of the day this finds you at. In this chapter, we are talking about problems in education and what school social workers can do in those situations. So let's go ahead and get started. The learning objectives for this chapter are to summarize the problems that school systems currently face. There's quite a number of them. We're going to describe the proposals for improving education. They are vast, and it kind of depends on your politics, typically, is what people's ideas about how to solve the problems where they come from. Suggest ideas for improving educational opportunities for children of low income and minority families. Why those? Well, those typically have the lowest test scores. And so there's the most room for improvement there. Summarize the functions of school social workers and describe several roles for school social work practice. Okay, so I am actually going to reverse the chapter a bit. If you've noticed so far, usually there's kind of like a lot of time and words dedicated to setting up the context. This is what's going on. These are the problems. These are the issues that need to be solved. And then toward the end of the chapter, we actually talk about what social workers would actually do there. I'm actually going to flip that around and focus on the functions of school social workers and what they do. Many schools do not have a social worker, so realize that. And many times social workers are coming into schools who have not had a social worker in the past. Maybe they're coming part-time, maybe they're on full-time. But either way, they oftentimes find they have to prove that they are value and that they are bringing something of worth for the administrators to pay them and for the uneasiness and the place that they may play among teachers and staff who may have to cooperate with them, and they may not have had to cooperate with them in the past. So realize that if you're going into these settings, you may not necessarily be welcomed with open arms, even if you feel like you're going to bring something that's really going to improve the situation. So the answer there is hang in there, do what works, and eventually the reputation you'll create a place for yourself, and people will appreciate you for that. All right. Uh, First role here, the school social worker. And again, they're calling this a response to crisis because as we'll find out here in a few slides, the school system is considered to be in crisis. Although I wonder if maybe we're idealizing the past, but that's for another slide. There are new laws that have been brought in, like No Child Left Behind and Every Student Succeeds, and they mandate things like that all students be given appropriate education. This creates a space for many social workers to be in the school, providing support for the students who are facing challenges like having special needs or mental health issues, experiencing issues like racism or poverty. So that's sort of the purpose of social workers in the schools. So, all right. What else? The traditional school social work roles, which are probably still the major part of what a social worker does at the schools, are things like there as followed. So, case managers. Let's talk about a story from the book, Mike, in this case, and that'll kind of give you like a picture of what a case manager looks like, or that role looks like for a social worker here. So, Mike is having trouble. He's having trouble in school. He's bullying. He's making a menace of himself. He's disrupting the classroom. So the first thing the social worker does is refer him, the family, to social services and to make sure that things like medical care and counseling and maybe they need new clothes. Maybe there's an agency, a thrift store, something that can help change the situation, you know, give even charity to that person. Creating a behavior modification system in the classroom, maybe also at home. This is going to reinforce positive behaviors that Mike cares about, right? Another thing would be understanding if Mike has any learning difficulties. Does he have maybe hearing problems? And then how the teacher can best meet those learning difficulties, assuming he has them. Um, what is going on in Mike's home? Helping mom understand that Mike's behavior is oftentimes attention seeking from adults, following the expression that it's better to be wanted for murder than not wanted at all. So maybe Mike is looking for attention and he's getting it by doing bad things. And so if mom understands that, then she can not pay attention to him when he's doing bad things and pay attention to him when he's doing good things, right? Mike oftentimes has trouble after dad leaves. So communicating with dad how he can develop a richer relationship with his son through Skype, through phone calls, even just a 5-minute check-in on Monday, Wednesday, Friday morning, just to establish a better relationship so that when dad leaves, you don't have an issue where Mike is torn apart for days afterward. So that is sort of what a case manager does. If you noticed, none of those things is really the social worker working directly with Mike on an extended basis. I mean, it's not like the social worker is doing counseling with him. It's like going to the professionals, going to the teachers, going to the parents, going to the social service agencies, reaching out to dad, setting up a behavior modification chart. And so while the social worker is working with Mike, or it's more like on Mike's behalf, working with other professionals. And that's kind of what a case manager is, or a case manager, that's what that service looks like. And many times social workers will do like multiple different roles. Like maybe they'll work with the client doing counseling, but they'll also work with other professionals, and that would be a case manager role. So moving on to talk about doing group work. As you might imagine, working with multiple people in an hour is more efficient than working with one person in an hour. It may not be as effective, but it might be more effective. There's benefits and positives to individual work as well as group work. So this could be things like peer support to help accomplish goals rather than just working with a professional. The example in the book there was that there's a group of kids and they're all acting out, acting badly. And so by breaking them up into groups with other kids and forcing those groups to work together to accomplish things as a group, you're learning all kinds of positive things. They're learning cooperation, they're learning to follow directions, they're learning appropriate, um, you know, peer interactions, their appropriate friendships, goal-directed behaviors, but it also could look like doing a group for study habits, and that doesn't have to be with like the quote-unquote bad kids. It could just be with students that are struggling to do well in school. I can tell you that a lot of people, probably myself included, would benefit from a group that's focused on how do you study, how do you take notes. Uh, a- these could be pairing an older student with a younger student. They could be about assertiveness training for kids that are having trouble getting along with peers, making friends. There could be a group focused on coping with loss. If it's a bigger school, then students are always experiencing loss of a pet, loss of a grandparent, loss of a parent potentially. There could be groups about drug and alcohol reduction. So lots of different groups that are possible there. Let's move on to truancy officers. A truancy officer advocates that the student be in school. It's not just a gotcha kind of a thing. It's about finding creative ways to keep and bring students to school. And it oftentimes involves working with the parents, telling them, helping them bring their child to school. Maybe the parent doesn't want the child to go to school for some reason, helping address those concerns and telling the parent that, hey, actually, this is the law. You have to send your child to school. Maybe the parents do want the child to be in school, but the child doesn't want to, helping the parents to reassert authority as a parent. Moving on here. Counselor and parent liaison. Okay, so a parent liaison is a social worker who is advocating in the best interests of the parent. And ultimately, though, I think that the social worker advocates for the best interest of the student, thinking about like as a truant officer, that is in the best case, in the best interests of a child. That doesn't mean the social worker always going to get their way and things are always going to be, going to change according to what they want. But that is where the social workers um, like loyalties lie, and this may get difficult at sometimes. It may be that the school says, no, we can't do that. We don't want to do that. And the social worker is going to have some hard conversations, right? So that requires a little bit of steel um, in your back. Is that the expression? I don't know. Regardless what the teachers or the parents think, the social worker is advocating for the best interests of the child. Um, Realize though that even though the counselor is a role that social workers can play, most of the time school social workers have to refer out to counseling to other professionals. There's just probably not enough room in their day, and so don't be surprised if that occurs. Some newer social work roles would include things like advocacy and behavioral specialist. Let's start with advocacy. This is similar to a lawyer in the sense that you contact a lawyer because they understand the court system way better than you do, and they are unequivocally on your side. They are required to work in your best interest. That's why you can have lawyers who will stand up for people who've obviously done the wrong thing because that's part of their job, right? And so they are working in the best interest of the student and explaining to the parent what can happen. They are helping teachers understand the student's situation at home or their intellectual level. They are um, in a sense, like school systems can be very complicated and procedures can be complicated, and a lot of parents sort of feel like the system is stacked against them. So as an advocate, you kind of like work to help them understand and work in the student's best interest. So, but let me just say, usually these line up with the schools and the teacher's desires, right? Normally that is what occurs, but a lot of times the parents misunderstand what's possible or just even how the system works, so you can create some misunderstanding there, and so advocates kind of help to bridge that gap. Let's talk about a behavioral specialist. A behavioral specialist uses reinforcements like praise to create things like a reward system, giving a child, like what they want. Hopefully something positive like, extra math lessons or, like, I don't know, 5 minutes of extra gym time. All right, picking up with homeless education liaison. They help schools to follow the law. There's a law that mandates schools to eliminate barriers to enrolling youth in schools, those that are homeless. And so that is, our particular law that requires a particular understanding of how to do that. And so social workers do that as well. Alcohol and substance abuse specialists. Emphasis on prevention, that is always much easier than a cure. But also for people who are currently having problems, getting help for them. And I guess emphasizing using alcohol in an unhealthy way. That probably gets a little bit tricky because most people in school are under 21, so they can't legally drink, but focusing specifically on those people who are maybe the highest risk. So they may involve finding or developing curriculum for the school. Individual education plan team member. Okay, so when someone has a documented disability of some sort, ADHD or dyslexia or something like that, they will create a team of professionals. Usually the principal's involved. It may hopefully the parent, I think, has to be there actually, and the social worker can be part of that team to meet the special education needs of that student.
part of the 2004 Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This is going to include things like an initial assessment of the child, emphasis on what is going on with the family and helping them to function, and then teaching the child adaptive skills. So, for instance, maybe maybe reading is tough, and so an audio player, maybe speaking is hard, and so some sort of technology that's going to help with that. It may be that helping the teacher by observing their classroom and supporting them is also what is needed. All right, I think we are now up to violence prevention specialist. A violence prevention specialist is somebody obviously that tries to think about the school and tries to find out ways what can we do as a school to reduce the amount of violence that occurs. Society in general has gotten more violent, and so have schools. Actually, I think that society now in the US, we're at a point where we have a mass shooting every day. And so there's violence toward students, and there's toward administrators, toward teachers, and a social worker can help develop policies, can help teachers become effective in nonviolent interventions, can help students do things like learn anger control techniques, having them to express their anger in nonviolent ways or in assertive ways. I feel like much of the, and maybe this is just anecdotal evidence, but it seems like the children that are involved in mass shootings, it's like they bundle it and they bundle it and they don't tell anybody until they come to school with a gun, and so it's like maybe if they had learned or been able to express their frustrations before that point, saying, hey, this person drives me crazy, or I don't like school because of this and this, that would have prevented them from being violent in the future. So how to walk away from a fight without losing peer respect. Things like, what else? Mediation, doing active listening, doing things like compromising, problem solving. These are all great things, actually, that you wouldn't need to target any specific person. Everybody could use these. I could use these. And I feel like as smartphones have become so much more ubiquitous, we're losing these skills, like how to compromise, how to problem solve, how to do active listening. And those oftentimes, if you can do those beforehand, there's no reason to do, like have the police come in and intervene in a situation. Unfortunately, many schools have actually hired off-duty police officers or people like that to come and police schools. So, all right. Other things like you can do teen courts where the students are actually judged by their peers. Yeah. So moving on. Systems change specialists. This is looking at the ways that the system is functioning to create the results that you currently see. I heard a crazy expression a few years ago, and it was something like, your system is perfectly tuned to get the results that you're currently achieving. Meaning, like, whatever you're getting now, like, that's because the system is creating that. Like, even in this classroom, like, whatever results I'm seeing from students, like, my systems are perfectly calibrated to get those results, right? So if I want to see different results, I need to change the system, right? Change the reward systems, change the communication systems, change the understandings, the culture, all these different things, right? What else? Creating a sense of welcome, that the idea that anything is possible, and that the marginalized, the people on the edges, are worth fighting for, right? That's, I think, this idea of superhero. You're trying to change situations that seemingly impossible. Like, if you go to a school and you want bad news, you're going to receive a lot of it. There's a lot of people that are saying a lot of bad things. But if you can be a voice of hope, if you can be a voice of, maybe that's true, but I'm curious. That's a nice way of saying it. I'm curious what would happen if we change this or that, right? Kind of having a sense of creativity. So. All right, so now that we've talked about what social workers can do, let's just talk about some of the problems that schools currently face. The education system has frequently been asked to resolve and alleviate social problems. Okay, if you were to think about a problem, I would say a lot of times the solution is better education. You know, we have drug use. Oh, what should we do? Oh, the schools should be teaching that. Oh, we have racism. Oh, we should do anti-racist talks. We have food insecurities. We should be feeding kids and sending them food home on the weekends, right? And maybe the schools are the right place to do that, but if you, it's just a constant like taking problems that society has and moving them to the schools. And it's just like we have a history of doing this. And it's like at some point the school is like, wait a minute, like we can't do everything. There's, you know, we are here for a purpose, and it seems like we're just keep adding more and more and more things, right? We do things like schools should alleviate poverty, right? Because the idea that they're gonna, you know, that students are going to know more than their parents. We're going to try to connect to a generation of distracted children because we now have more information coming at us than ever before. We're going to teach kids how to be good citizens. We're going to decrease violence. We're going to eliminate bullying, right? And all of that is going to be done with a flat budget. That's what administrators talk about, that they do not receive more money. They have a flat budget, and the cost of everything from paper clips to teacher salaries continue to go up. So, as you can probably hear from my voice, this is a very difficult thing to do, right? And so, what better place if you're looking for a challenge, if you're looking for a purpose, you want to escape the meaninglessness that maybe you see out in the world, go work in a school, because there's just a lot of need there. And so, let's talk about some controversies, right? Some controversies, the quality of education. Right, we'll talk about more about this. Equal access to quality education. Not everybody gets the same access to good schools. And there are some really good schools in the United States, but not everybody gets to go to those, right? There's a lot of confusion around the goals of education. You know, I mentioned all those things that we're adding to schools, but what is actually the purpose? Because you can't do everything, right? So what is going to stay and what is going to be emphasized and what is not? Changes in technology and difficult working conditions. So let's start tackling those. Oh, okay. My little Maslow's hierarchy of needs here, right? So one of the things that our book talks about is if a student is having trouble with the basics of life, food, shelter, safety, right? Then they're going to have a really hard time focusing on things that are kind of non-essential, especially for the moment, like mathematics beyond, you know, like basic addition and subtraction, right? Things that are more like Shakespeare, you know, like that's up here somewhere, you know, and if you're struggling with the basics, it's like your brain may not be able to take in anything beyond food, shelter, safety, right? So that is why I could be wrong when I say things like schools maybe aren't meant to focus on food and safety, because if you don't have that, maybe the students can't listen, right? So that's why we have laundry machines in schools. That's why we send food home. That's why we focus on some of the basics, because if you don't have those, then maybe you can't build up. My point is that we are not funding those, and so that frustrates me when we give so much responsibility to schools and then don't back them up with salaries and the budgets that makes those sort of things possible. So, all right, quality of education. 1 out of every 5 adults, that is, yeah, 20%, have a below basic level literacy skills. They're not going to be able to read a newspaper, right? U.S. students continue to be outperformed by students in other developed countries, countries that have less money, their economy is smaller. But on the other hand, even though the U.S. ranks in the middle of industrialized countries, you know, so like we're 38 out of 71 in math and 24 out of 71 in science and reading. So like we're like kind of right in the middle in terms of math and like toward the front, but certainly not in the top 20 even in science and reading. We spend more money $15,000 per student per year compared to 10,000 roughly in other richer countries. So something's funny, right? Maybe in those other countries, here's my suspicion, in those other countries, the other parts of society do more things. So like there's health insurance that government provides in basically every other country on that list. There is less crime in those other countries, things like that. So teachers in the US work more on average than teachers in other, again, richer participating countries. So, all right, here's some data to back up this idea that we're struggling. So as you can see, in the United States, we have the lowest levels of vocabulary amongst the poor or the low educated parents. Okay, so here's what this does. We looks at 4 different countries and it says, okay, the red students, their parents are highly educated. They have master's degrees, they have bachelor's degrees. The ones in blue have middle education. So they have like, they finished high school, maybe they've got a year or 2 of post high school education. And then the low educated, those who maybe dropped out of high school or maybe they got a GED, things like that. And so what you can see is that children tend to follow their parents. That is why they have lower scores of vocabulary compared to their richer peers. And that's true not just in the United States, that's true in a bunch of other, ironically, all English-speaking countries. But when it comes to the poor, in the United States, the poor actually have the smallest vocabularies compared to the United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada. In fact, Canada has the best there. In terms of middle educated, they're actually all the same. But the highly educated parents in the United States, these children here are actually the best, right? And so one of the things that I believe is that in some ways we actually have the best schools in the world. It's just that we only have a handful of them, and the students that go to those are rich, or their parents are rich, and the parents are highly educated. And we also have some terrible schools in the United States, and the students that go to those, their parents tend to be poor and tend to be poorly educated. So you kind of mix all those good schools and bad schools together in the United States, and that's what kind of puts us in the middle there compared to other countries. All right, equal access to quality education. Parents with lower levels of education tend to struggle to give guidance to their children, right? The child comes home with a question about Shakespeare, and the parents are like, I didn't really get Shakespeare. I kind of slept in that class. Or this student has a question about Spanish, and this parent's like, I didn't study Spanish. I don't know anything about Spanish or physics or anything like that. And so, or the child says, hey, I'm thinking about going to college. Should I go to a 4-year college? Should I go to a 2-year college? And the parent struggles to help the child in kind of guiding, because in some ways it's like the child's creating a new path that the parents didn't themselves take, right? An egalitarian society, so as an equal society, has a responsibility to provide equal opportunity for high quality education for all of its citizens, right? That would be ideal if we were serious about giving each child a chance at being amazing. Then we would give each child an amazing education. We obviously don't do that, And in fact, for a child, the best predictor of how far they will go in their education is not how smart they are or what their IQ is or anything that maybe you would think that should actually be the thing that causes the child to go farther. The best indicator is how far their parents went. So we tend to follow in our parents' footsteps, even though we would, as a society, wish that it was not that way. So we have burned out teachers, we have more crowded classrooms, and we have a lack of opportunity. So what is going on here? We have something called resegregation, and white flight. So when Brown versus Board of Education went before the Supreme Court, which is a famous, Supreme Court case in which they ruled that separate but equal, meaning between whites and people of color, that is not constitutional. And so the schools were supposed to desegregate, to join together, but they haven't, right? Now, legally, there's nothing that prevents people from mixing, but the issues are they're still segregated because you tend to go to a school based upon where you live geographically. And so what you have in the United States typically is pockets of racial groups, pockets of economic groups, really is what it's more about that than it is about racial groups, but it tends to fall along racial lines. And so you have pockets of Latinos and pockets of African Americans and pockets of whites and pockets of Asians, and they tend to go to those schools together. So you tend to have white schools who have a few Latinos, a few Asians, but tend to be, predominantly white. And then you have schools that's predominantly African American, but you have a few Latinos and you have a few whites, but it's a predominantly African American school. So we still have segregation, right? Now they try to kind of combine those by busing kids around. It's just that on an individual level, while parents might approve of it for other people's children, when it comes to their own children, so for instance, you got a white middle class family living in the suburbs of Chicago, they might like the idea of integration, but what happens is when their child gets put on a bus and driven to a school that is primarily African American in terms of its population, what the parents realize is, wait a minute, this school that they're being bused to is inferior in terms of test scores and safety than the school that is in their neighborhood. And so what oftentimes happens is that they will withdraw their child from that school and put them in a private education or homeschool or something like that. And they'll do so with sort of a tear in their eye, at least I like to think that, because they'll say to themselves, I like the idea of integration. I like the idea that we wouldn't be such a racialized society. The issue is education is really, really important for my child. It's sort of his ticket to his future, and I'm not willing to put my child in an inferior school, even if it advances racial goals on the whole. So white flight refers to what happened after desegregation. Many white parents, in this way, it was more racial. I don't, whatever. Anyway, I realized that no white person thinks of themselves as being racist, and so I recognize that. So I'm always aware of that when I accuse some people of being racist and other people of not being racist. But white flight was where when desegregation happened and the white schools were forced to accept primarily African Americans into their academic halls, a lot of white families put their children in private schools, right? So they say like in the 1960s, it was people that didn't like, parents that didn't like black people withdrew their children from the private schools. Today, it's parents that don't like poor people that withdraw their children and put them in private schools. My dream, it would be that every child would have an amazing education, and I'm not sure exactly how to do that. I have a few ideas, but we could just you could focus on just the basics, like you could say, like, make sure every child has access to a book that's 5 years or less old, and make sure that no teacher is like impoverished while they're working full time at a school and things of that nature. So one of the things to realize is that property taxes, local property taxes, a lot of funding comes from that. And so in neighborhoods that are very rich, where the property values are really high, then you have a lot of money going to the schools. And in neighborhoods where the property values are low, and there's a lot of like libraries and museums and older people, which tends to be inner cities, it's a lot less property taxes being created, and so those schools tend to be underfunded. I'm going to move on. I've been talking for a while. All right. Here is a map that kind of shows the segregation of, based upon algebra exam scores. And so the darker the red, the higher the score. It's not super easy to see here. Um, yeah, the darker the score, the higher, the better, right? So what you can see is that right here on Long Island, you have some really dark, right? And then in kind of upper New York City, you have some dark around Albany. And so it's not equal, right? You have pockets where students are really performing a lot better than others, right? And then on my right over here, it's how much funding per student, right? And what you can see is that, um, well, the darker the red, the higher the test score, right? And there's not a ton of correlation, a little bit of correlation, but it's not like automatically like right over here in Albany. I think that's Albany. Um, the test scores are higher, but the funding is not higher, right? So you have something else going on, and so I recognize that. And so, all right, but my main point here was that you definitely have pockets of children that are scoring a lot higher, and then students that are scoring a lot lower, and that's kind of, it's not equally dispersed. All right, confusion about the goals of education. Boy, education has become so much more controversial in the last 20 years. It was not always like this. For those of you that are young, I just want you to know that we weren't always fighting so much about what's happening to schools. We didn't used to have people showing up at board meetings threatening and harassing teachers and administrators and board members like we do today. So one side says that the school should really be about teaching the basic skills of reading, writing, and mathematics. And that's really the primary thing that the school should do. And so 80% of the resources and meetings and times should be about figuring out the best way of doing those things. But other people say, actually, that's kind of outdated. There's so many more other things that if you don't teach them, they're not going to be able to do the reading, writing, and mathematics. So for instance, sexual harassment. So if you have women who are going, or girls who are going to school and they're being sexually harassed, they're not going to be able to learn reading and writing and mathematics. And if you have students that are high, and then more recently we have talk about gender. So we would say, hey, if a student is non-binary and they're going to school and they're being harassed, then they're not going to be able to learn. Right? In the 60s, I think it was, prayer in school was a controversy. So other people say, you know what, these things about writing and mathematics, this is all going away. The need for it is going away because of technology like AI and whatnot. And so what they say is we need to focus on creativity, right? And so, I would say, I'm not sure about that, but you get the idea that some people say we need to go back to the basics, the basic skills of reading and writing like what we did with our great grandparents. But one of the things to realize is that we tend to idealize the past, right? And so maybe we weren't that good at school in the past either, but we kind of assume that we were. In my family, we read a lot of Little House on the Prairie books, and they're all studying the exact same book, from school to school, and that's all they're focused on is just these readers, and it's a lot of heavy emphasis on basics. So, um, you know, um, different sides of the political spectrum will say different things. Conservatives say that we need to go back to the basics and removing things that have been added over the last 40 years. So like sex education, drug abuse education, everything, anything related to gender, and we need to focus on the basics. And teachers' salaries should be based upon their students' achievements. Right? More liberal people say, no, actually, we need a whole lot more funding, and we need to kind of redesign the education system starting from the ground up. And so we're kind of caught in the middle, and the taxpayers tend to say, don't tax me anymore. Right? I actually listened to an article on NPR the other day, and it was a Texas school, and they were saying that they just couldn't get the teachers because they weren't paying them enough. So they asked for tax raises, and nobody wanted to pay more taxes, and they voted it down every year. And so the school started cutting the number of days that the students are in school from 5 to 4, right? With the idea that they could then offer that to the teachers, like, hey, come work for ABC school because you only have to work 4 days a week. But then other schools started doing the same thing, and then they kind of lost their competitive edge. Meanwhile, parents now have to think about what to do with their child on Fridays when they would have normally been in school, but now they're not. And so, anyway, it's a controversial, big, I'd say, very important thing. Changes in technology. I got to get through this quicker. Um, Teachers are increasingly asked to use technology in the classroom, right? Students are, being encouraged to use technology because it's like, hey, you're going to be using this at work, so the sooner you get access to this, the better. Obviously, there's going to be a real unequal access to technology in the United States. Like some people are going to have high-speed internet in their house, and their parents are using technology, and other kids are going to be out in the boonies where the cell phone signal isn't even good, and so they're going to have much more trouble using this technology. Difficult working conditions for some teachers. School shootings make a work environment not attractive, right? Do you want to go work at a place where there's shootings? Probably not, right? And other teachers are disenchanted. They maybe came because they wanted to help students and they wanted to connect with students and teach them the love of learning, and low pay and not being, respected by teachers or administrators or the public in general. Believe it or not, 40 years ago, teachers were much more respected than they are today. They're still that way in some countries, but today there's a lot of suspicion around teachers, like they're indoctrinating kids into some sort of weird alternative reality, and this puts a lot of stress, right? You have increased classroom sizes. Let's see. There's school bullying and cyberbullying. It may be that you're really good at teaching literature, but you're not very good at dealing with bullying, right? And so it almost becomes very difficult for you to do your job, because it's not just about teaching writing or teaching math, but also about meeting kids where they are, and maybe that means meeting, the bullying where it is, and that's difficult to do. All right. One of the things that I think is sad and scary is that the number of people majoring in education continues to go down. If you start here in 2005, you've got 10% of incoming freshmen who are selecting education, and then as time goes on, this number just keeps going down to today, or the last time we looked at the numbers, which was 7 years ago now, it was 4% of incoming education majors. I just don't know what you do. Like, what are we going to do? Where are the teachers going to come from? There are some schools even around here that are using substitutes, but they're using them on a permanent basis. And so maybe that's going to become more and more popular. But it seems like this is a big need, and we need to do something. We need to do it quick, because it takes a while for culture to change. And so we have to convince more people that going into education is a worthy endeavor. All right, with all of these problems, what are we going to do? Well, there's 4 proposals that are given for improving the school systems. That is, increase the incentives for teachers. Give the teachers more so that they want to continue teaching. There's a big teacher dropout that we're seeing right now, but also the more incentives, the larger the carrot, so to speak, the more people are going to be interested in being teachers. You can improve the curriculum. You can give parents more choice in their schools. You can increase safety measures and expand preschool programs. So let's look at those in more detail here. We certainly need to recruit more people into education. We might think, well, can't the computers just teach them? That's not a realistic option, for better or worse. So we need to have more people come into the field. This gives administrators the ability to let go of poor teachers. So one of the positive things about when you have more people who are interested in being teachers is that when the teachers are there that are not effective, the administrators have the ability to let them go, assuming their union doesn't prevent it. But that's kind of another issue. Right now, administrators can't let go teachers because they don't have anybody else to fill them with, right? So more teachers means the expectations are higher because of the competition. The schools can say, listen, if you're going to work here, we have high expectations. And if you can't meet those, then you can go somewhere else. But if you don't have other teachers who are willing to fill those spots, that talk is not true. It's um, all right. And then more social supports for teachers within the schools. You know, what that could look like a lot of different things, but everything from feeding them non-cafeteria food to giving them mental health days to giving them more aides in the classroom to giving them bigger budgets for their classrooms, all those sort of things. All right, improving the curriculum, right? So there's been a move toward teaching basic skills, right, and away from teaching electives. That actually has started a long time ago. According to our book, there was this push back in the when we were having the space race with Russia. So this would have been like in the 60s. So, No Child Left Behind was a law signed under President W. Bush to improve schools through testing and accountability. Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015 was President Obama's version of that. It expanded access to preschool protection. It expanded access to preschools. It protect high-risk students, and it largely built on No Child Left Behind. There is also a Common Core, which everybody loves that, right? It seeks to establish a national standard for education. It's the idea so that you're like learning the same style of math in Alabama as you are in Connecticut, right? Hopefully, the idea being that we figured out the best way of doing it, and we're just going to have everybody do that one standard. All right, allowing parental choice of schools. Here's the idea. The idea kind of came from George W. Bush's No Child Left Behind idea, more of a conservative idea, kind of like saying, hey, let's kind of introduce some free market, some capitalism into education by saying to schools, hey, listen, if you're failing, then we are going to let parents choose their own school for their child. Right? So that schools are like, oh, like we didn't know they could leave, but now that they can leave, we'll do things better, is kind of the idea, right? It kind of undermines the neighborhood school concept because students then potentially could be going outside of their neighborhood if their school is not doing well, and tax dollars go with them, right? There's also what charter schools. Charter schools are publicly funded but privately managed. And so there's some, interesting research on that. And then there's homeschooling, which is the idea that the parents can teach their children themselves, has become much more popular since the pandemic. However, it is probably unrealistic for most families, as most families require two-parent income in order to survive. And so we probably saw a spike in homeschooling during the pandemic because most parents were doing it anyways. And then I imagine that's probably going to trickle off a bit. But as schools become more dangerous and more controversial, there is more homeschooling. An increase in safety in schools, right? So there are policies that have been shown to create more safe schools, and so those can be implemented. You can address mental health and substance abuse issues of students. The idea being that violent students have mental health issues or substance abuse issues. And then what kind of school policies are in place that are either allowing or discouraging school violence? Let's kind of zero in on those. For instance, like, if there's an unfair like rules that say benefit athletes, that's one you hear about a lot, that the athletes can, beat up people and they just get like a slap on the wrist, whereas somebody else that's not an athlete, they get into a fight and they're suspended for 3 days, something like that. That creates a lot of hostility and anger within a school environment. Expanded preschool programs rather. So there's some research that shows that if you have students in preschool programs, especially quality preschool programs, then that benefits them all through their schooling careers, because it's like they get a head start, right? In fact, we actually have a head start here at Southern Illinois. And so if a student goes to school and they are not behind because they've been in preschool learning, tactile things and their colors and maybe a little bit of numbers, a little bit of the alphabet, then they get to school and they're like, oh, I can do this. This is cool. I can use a pencil. I know know some of my alphabet, things like that. Suggest ideas for improving educational opportunities for children of low income and minority families. Okay, so studies show that students who are of minority status, like race or ethnicity, they tend to go to schools that are poorer, and poorer schools tend not to produce as high quality students. And so what do? So you can try to equalize the amount of money that's spent on each student's education, right? So if you go to like the rich suburbs and you compare it with the poor inner city, there's a little big difference in the amount of money that's spent. So if we can equalize that, that might help to increase the amount of students in the inner city schools that graduate or that feel engaged and excited about their education, go on to college, things of that nature, right? And so this is not popular among people who are paying too much money for their house in the suburbs so their kids can go to the well-funded public school. That's probably why it hasn't really changed. But another idea is that the federal government could pay for all schooling, right? So if you don't fund it through property taxes and the federal government just funds it through income tax, let's say, then everyone gets the same amount. Compensatory education, right? So compensatory education is education that is aimed at where the student is. So rather than teaching something to a student, teaching teaching multiplication to a student who hasn't learned addition is not really going to be very helpful. And so special programs and extra assistance that's aimed at improving students who are struggling, and you're going to see more students who are struggling who are in poverty and of minority status. So, all right. Implementation of trauma-sensitive or trauma-informed and socio-emotional learning curriculum and programs. Okay, quite a mouthful there. Trauma-sensitive is aware that some people are triggered by the lighting and the smells and the sounds and the way the chairs are located. And so being aware that, hey, when I do this thing, this person may be triggered because they've had traumatic events that have happened in their past. So let's see what we can do to try to eliminate those for every student, not just focusing on like, oh, this person's been traumatized, but that person hasn't. That's going to be pretty difficult. Let's just focus on what can we do across the board. So for instance, like the lighting and the paint on the walls and the pictures that are on the walls, things like that. So more attention is being paid to the impacts of trauma on children. Trauma's been kind of a big word, big topic for the last 10 years. And so teaching kids how to regulate their emotions, to deal with big emotions and how to think of themselves, how to show empathy, that may lead to decreased stress and less violence and improved test scores. However, if you're of the mindset that schools need to get back to the basics, then that may not be something that you would want. So, all right, curbing bullying and cyberbullying. Gosh, a lot of different things that you can do here. Several things here mentioning where children can be taught how to deal with strong emotions so they don't bully, how to deal with bullies themselves so they're not overly affected. Bullies tend to focus on the weak and people they think they can get away with. So teaching children how to not be that person who is viewed as being weak, and teaching children how to tell authority figures and practicing with the kids, teaching kids how to defend themselves physically, things like that. All right, well, that is this chapter. Thank you for watching till the end. I apologize, it's been longer than I wanted it to be.